Okay, welcome back. Now let's dive in yet another level deeper and let's walk through creating or editing a KPI and understanding how it interacts with the data sources and some of the core features. Now we went through a lot of patterns that kind of repeat themselves throughout. Now we'll just go just one level deeper. Now in the last section, I created a new KPI called training. But I didn't attach it to any data. I really didn't do anything. I did the bare minimum. I gave it a name and I gave it a group to be a member of. And that's it for now. So let's go through and talk about other things I may want to do. So you'll see that I have a display order column here. I'm going to go ahead and give that a display order. I'm going to give it 0 to try and make it show up at the top. There's already one in here that has a display order of 0, so I'm going to make that 1 so that I really get the top slot here. And I'm going to click Save. And now possibly when I refresh right away, it'll make it right up there to the top. So you can see that once I save, it's actually running in the server because this web browser is not talking to the designer, it's talking to the Visual KPI server. Okay, so now I have that. If I give it a description, I can just type description in here and save that. You'll slowly see these things start to appear in the background. Now, let's talk about all the next section, which is really everything that has to do with the KPI specific data. So everything from a minimum to a maximum. In the very middle of all those is the actual and the target. And then on each side of the actual target are the low limits, triple low, double low, and low. And up above are the higher limits, high, double high, triple high. Now, as you saw earlier in the training, and then max on the end. As you saw earlier in the training, you can control the names of these status options. If I had renamed them, they'd be renamed here as well. But in my case, I'm using it as it sits out of the box, so default names. Okay, now let's talk about what your options are then. Let's start in the middle. Let's give this thing some data. So I have this historian attached to this data source, which you can see a lot of my other KPIs are coming from. It's just really easy to work with, and that's called a PI system from OSIsoft. And I'm going to give this a sample tag, like CDT158 happens to be a sample tag in there. And this is giving my data an actual value. Now you notice I'm just saying, what do I want to get? That's the actual. And where do I want to get it from? That's the interface. Okay, nothing else. I'm not saying how much of it I want. I'm not saying how long a time frame. I'm not saying anything. All that happens outside. It's very simple and lightweight how our interfaces work. So if I save that and go immediately back to the browser here, you will see that I should have, now I have data. I still don't have any status because there's no concept of a limit or a threshold that I've crossed to say whether this is good or bad or not. But I have data. Here, by default, I have 8 hours of data. If I click on this, here's a week worth of that data. If I change the time range, I could look at 60 days worth of that data. If I want to zoom in on it, right into this little window of time, I can say, show me exactly what that is, or what's right in here in this little piece of data, or move it around, etc. Scroll out with my scroll wheel, anything, all that data is there. Could even look into the future if there was future data on there. Okay, so that's all I needed to do to get a live running trend of my data. But again, it's not a KPI yet, so it doesn't have any status and it can't build a lot of the visualizations because it's not really complete yet. Okay, you'll see my description also showed up in there. So let's give it one single limit. But before I do, let me talk about the options you have for all these. First, I already mentioned that almost everything in the system is optional. Okay, so in the targets and limits space, one of the most important ones you can have is blank, right? You don't have to have a limit. You don't have to have multiple limits. You don't have to have all of these filled out. Okay, the second option is just a fixed value, like 90. And let's do that over here. Let's put 95 as a fixed value for the low limit. Click Save. Go over here to the user experience. I'll force a refresh. Eventually it would come on its own, but in my case, I'll have to wait for the cache cycle for this one to show up. You see the actuals are currently 129, which means my KPI, if it stays that way, should be good. So there it is. It's in a good state. Shows that it recently changed status. So it's now at 134, which means it's over 95, which means it's in a good state. Okay, so that's one. And you'll see if I trend that good limit, if you can see it, it's light blue down here, is just a flat line. And that flat line goes even out into the future because it's a fixed value for all of time. The second option I could do is turn this into a manually entered value. So it's still a fixed value, but when I choose manual data entry here, that also means it's going to record all of my changes. So I'm going to click there, and now I've set 95 as its value, but that also looked at the exact point in time where I saved it. So if I refresh this trend now, and I'm going to look here, you'll see you can't see that. You can see it going forward, but you can't see it in the background. And I'm going to zoom in to the smallest amount possible here. I need to even zoom in further so that you can see here's the exact point in time where I made the limit 95. And now if I go in here and I change it to 125, and then I click save, the moment I save it, it's going to record that it changed, and it's going to keep all that history. Now I can let this just wait and it'll refresh itself. In this case, I'm just going to force it for speed and go right back here and zoom in again. And I got to zoom in a little farther so you can see it. So now you can see it was going on at 95 and then it jumped up to 125. Sorry for the color I happen to choose, but that's a manually entered moving limit. So every time it's changed, the history of it's recorded. So that's your second option for a limit. Your third option is to get a limit from a data source. So here's me getting the exact same value for the actual, but for a limit. Here's another KPI where I'm getting the actual from one data source, and I'm getting the target from a different data source. This one comes from a historian, this one comes from a SQL database. Here's one where one comes from a historian as part of a calculation, and this one is a manually entered value. Okay, so there's lots of different options. Let me go through a few more. Here's a calculation based on another column in the data source. Okay, or here is even better. This is a calculation that says whatever the target is, multiply it times 0.8 and make that the low limit. Well, the target is a function of another calculation and also a moving thing. So basically, whatever the results are of this at each point in time, this is multiplied by it, and you get a very dynamic target and limit. In fact, let's go look at that KPI. That's the gross megawatts one. And if I click in here, you can see that that low limit is a function of the target. Okay, so if I even turn off like the double low limit, so it'll zoom in a little bit more here, and now you can see the low and the target are a function of each other. Okay, so that's another option you have there. The third is actually a calculation from multiple things from a single data source. Okay, this is this value divided by this value from a single data source. And you can do calculations as complex as you want in these, but the limitation for doing it right here in this way is that there can only be one data source in this cell. Okay, there's another way to get around that, which is the most sophisticated way to do calculations in the system, and that is through a feature called parameters, which we are going to talk about in a little bit more detail here. Okay, so parameters is a way to add things from multiple data sources, even other calculations, and then use the results of those calculations in another calculation here. So this one has 3 different data sources in it, P1, P2, and P3. And let me just show you that really quickly. If you go all the way out to the right to the extended section, and then you'll see these parameters here. And they're just like those limits or any other thing that column interface pair. So it's saying, go get this, go get this, go get this. And this part could be a whole calculation and more sophisticated if you want. And then that's P1, P2, and P3. And those can be used again in a calculation over here. So just to summarize there, you have the ability to have nothing in these limits or target. You have fixed values. You have calculations. You have manually entered fixed values. You have calculations using a data source. You have other data sources. And you even have parameters. So you can kind of take it to a large level. Now, while we're here, let me just go to our website and show you how to find all the supported functions. So let's just go to transpara.com. Go over here to the knowledge base. And the easiest way to find this is to just type the word functions. And it should search it. Here's your functions and formulas reference guide, the first one that comes up in the list. And then there's this very long list of all the types of functions. We support if, then, else, and all kinds of fun stuff in here. So anyways, it's just transpara.com/knowledge-base/functions if you want to go directly to it. All right, so that is a little bit about this first section of a KPI. Let's go back to my KPI that we made, the training KPI, and you can see I now have status, and I have this very boring bar out here, which really doesn't show me much. So let's do a little bit more to make this KPI interesting. This KPI runs in the hundreds. Let's say that the minimum it's ever going to get to is 0. And the minimum and the maximum are pretty important because they also determine whether a KPI is in an unknown state. And an unknown state means when it's beyond what you think is its logical limitations. Let me give you an example. If I was looking at a percentage KPI, that should only be between 0 and 100%. If I see something like a negative number in percent, then it's probably something wrong with my data, and I want the system to automatically highlight that as something unknown. So it calls it to my attention that, hey, it's probably not just something going wrong, it's something wrong with my data. So it also helps with the definition of these charts. So let's say that this bullet chart goes between 0, and I'm going to scroll over here to max, and say that it goes to 300. Okay. And now I really only have a low and a good, but let's just save that. Go over to this KPI again. I'm going to refresh it. See if that one has to go to cache. It does, so that's going to take a second. And then it's going to now show me what those ranges are once it shows up. So let's let that one, now it's there. So now you can see I have a low range and a good range. I don't have any other ranges. I'm in the good range, but just barely. So let's set a target for this data, for this KPI. And again, we have lots of different ways that we can do it, but let's just make a manual one. Let's say that 175, or not a manual, but a fixed numeric one. Let's save it. And as soon as I have a target on my data, then you'll see one of these lines here. And that'll show up as soon as the cache cycle runs, probably about another 20 seconds or so. So we'll leave that one while we continue on. Okay, and then let's add one more limit up here. Let's say our max was what, 300? Let's say that the triple high is anything over 275. So between 275 and 300, this would be considered triple high. Let's save that. And you'll see as I refresh, now I have that target in there. So that one showed up, and when the next cache cycle runs, which is very quickly, you'll see my other range. So this is where you'll see a KPI get all these various ranges when it has more limits on it. The vertical or the horizontal line is the actual, the vertical is its target, and all these colored sections are its actual ranges. So you see now I have most things going in my KPI here. Right? A lot of information there. So hopefully you're seeing this pattern of how I get min and max, limits, target, and then of course the actual value. And I can get any one of these from a data source, even my min and max if it changes. Might even change throughout the day. Okay, so the next thing that I have as I scroll to the right are all of the custom attributes. And these are, again, optional. But in this case, let's say that the plant name equals Exton. And if I have it at Exton, then that, in this case, is going to eliminate the need for me to make it a fixed member of Exton. I'll show you that when we get to groups. I'm going to leave it there for now. But that is the little designation that makes it also a member of the group Exton. And I could say, let's make this one of the, let's call it geothermal here, so it's unique by itself. So I'm saying that that's what type of KPI this one is, or what type of unit it belongs to. Okay, so we can put these in all these, we can fill in any of these or leave them blank. Okay, now let's go back over here and see if this has filled in. Yep, now I have my double high limit. I don't have a high or a double, sorry, my triple high. I don't have a double or a single high limit, and I only have a low. I don't have double low or triple low. Okay, again, I can change all these colors, do everything else. So you can see how a KPI was created and how it became a member of a particular group. Now, if I look at this group another way, here is a set of KPIs that I think I saved this, right? Let me make sure I did. Here's a set of KPIs that include my training KPI up here. And if I group this by unit type, you should see my training one is still undefined. So once cache runs, we'll see that that will become part of geothermal. There it is. So now I have only one KPI in geothermal, one in hydro, and a bunch of these other ones in coal and gas. Okay, so your users, once this information is decorated, can use this in any way they want. They can filter and pivot without building complex pivot tables or OLAP cubes or any of that other crazy stuff. So very rapid to build. Now, let's also talk about this KPI analysis between 0 and a couple hundred. I can change how many decimal places. So if I have a very sophisticated data source that's going to give me 20 decimal places, but I don't want to show that much to my users, then I can put in the format here, how much I want to show. And then I can also put the unit of measure. So let's say this one was also a pressure KPI. So this would be PSI. And then if it's PSI, then I would want that to appear after the number. But if it was dollars, I would want the unit of measure to appear before the number. Okay, so we'll put it like that. And if I save this now, go back over here, eventually you'll see that this now says PSI on it. So it knows what its unit of measure is. So these are some of the basic things that you want to get. I won't do any alerting on this one right now, but let's go talk about a few other things. Let me go over and give this one some geolocation. So I'm going to go over here to Google Maps, and let's find a home for this. I'm here in San Francisco right now. Let's zoom out. Let's put this KPI right in the middle of Alcatraz Island here. Let's put it right in the laundry building. So if I right click and say what's here, then you'll see down at the bottom it'll give me that geolocation. Oops. If I click on that, it'll give it to me up here. I just copy that. I'm going to paste it on my new KPI down here and take this one off. Put it on the longitude. And save this. Now I have, oops, hang on, escape. And save that. Go back over to my KPI here. Let's make sure it's nice and refreshed. Make sure my little globe icon is showing up. Not yet. Let's give it a second. Now it's showing up there. So this one shows me that there's geolocation on it and on this one. There's only two on this. If I click here, now you can see that one of those KPIs is over near Philadelphia, and one of them is right here in San Francisco. Let's zoom in on it and see where that KPI ended up being. It's now in a low state. Let's go right on to satellite. And there it is right on the laundry building. And I can even open that up and see the trend. That's my training KPI with a description of description. It's actual and it's target. And I can either close that back down or I can click on it and see a live trend of it. Okay, so that is all it takes to give this geolocation. Pretty powerful concept. All right, I'll keep going here a little bit and try to get done without killing all of your time. But here is the SPC section. We have a separate video on SPC that you can look at. We'll provide a link to that. But really, it's a way to determine things are in and out of control, and it also involves these Western electric rules, which determine whether something should be considered in or out of control, and a few advanced SPC features. Okay, but it's really a way to really rapidly make SPC KPIs rather than buying a whole dedicated, usually very complex package of software just for SPC that requires a tremendous amount of expertise. So in our case, a really fast way to do that. Okay, and then lastly, let's put a link on our new KPI or something in the info column. So we have our training KPI. Let's say that we want to go get let's get something from a data source. Let's get sawtooth, sawtooth from a SQL data source. Let's get it from this sample data. Let's not give it a unit of measure or a numeric format, and let's give it a link. Let's say we want to link it to https://transpara.com, and let's call it Transpara. Okay, save that. And now eventually over here in our list of KPIs, let's go back to where we have it. There's our training KPI, and now it has a link to Transpara right in it. And it's actually getting a value too. So let's not give it the description, or that's the tooltip, I guess. So it should be getting sawtooth there. Okay, and there's its link. That's the info URL, info description. Okay. Let me make sure I've got that working right. Let's make sure this SQL database has something called sawtooth in it. There it is, 100.6. So, and it's linked to Transpara. So if I click that, it's going to take me right over to transpara.com. All right, so that's how to do links. So that is a lot about creating objects, how to control the display, what things are required or not, and there's a lot more to it. So I'm going to take a break now, and we'll go to our last section and talk about groups and a few of the other visualizations. See you there.